powerful naval gunnery halted the first German offensive just 7 kilometers from the city. The 12-inch guns of the coastal fort of Krasnoye Gorka also served to hold the German army at bay. The shock waves from their exploding shells were powerful enough to hurl German tanks into the air. But where the German army had failed, the Luftwaffe might still succeed. Three months into the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Army Group North was held up outside Leningrad by the heavy guns of the Soviet Baltic Fleet. So Field Marshal von Lieb turned to his dive bombers to sink the enemy warships. Their first victim was the old battleship Mara. Two 1,000-kilogram bombs struck her bow, causing her forward turret magazine to explode. She quickly sank to the bottom of the bay. 3 warships were sunk in total, depriving the city's defenses of 35 powerful guns. Around the city, 1,500 loudspeakers broadcast Leningrad city radio. Now it was also used to issue air raid warnings. When there were no radio programs, a metronome was put on the air. Slow ticking meant all clear. Fast ticking meant take cover. It became known as the beating heart of Leningrad. Above the city, German bombers were met with heavy anti-aircraft fire. But the Luftwaffe only made a few large-scale raids. Shelling by German heavy artillery proved much more lethal. Signs went up on street corners with the warning, "Citizens, this side of the street is more dangerous during shelling." The Germans didn't target Leningrad's tallest buildings or church spires. They were needed as reference points by the artillery spotters, who instead guided shells onto the city's bridges, houses, and shops. Leningrad was truly a city on the front line. Monuments were protected by sandbags and wooden screens, but many would not survive German bombardments. On the city's outskirts, the Germans captured the Catherine Palace and the Grand Petergoff Palace. Both were looted and destroyed. The world-famous Amber Room was shipped to Germany. Today, its whereabouts remain a mystery. On the 8th of September, German bombers targeted the wooden Badaev warehouses, where the city's food reserves were stored. The glow of the fires could be seen across the city. Soon everyone knew that the flour and sugar supplies had been destroyed. But the situation was even worse than many feared. The city needed 1,000 tons of food every day to prevent starvation, but less than 200 tons were getting through the blockade. The little that could be brought in by air was nowhere near enough to feed the city's population. The main supply route into Leningrad now lay across Lake Ladoga, 50 kilometers of open water. But the lake was notorious for its strong winds and sudden storms. It was why, in 1718, Peter the Great had ordered the construction of the Ladoga Canal along the lake's southern shore to provide a safe waterway to the city. But the Germans had reached the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, cutting the canal and rail links into the city. The people of Leningrad had to build a new port from scratch on the lake's western shore. In the first week of the siege, barges were unloaded straight onto the beach. It was the beginning of a supply route that would come to be known as the Road of Life. Food rationing had been introduced at the start of the war. Leningrad workers received 800 grams of bread a day. Their dependents received 400 grams. By the beginning of October, it had been reduced to half that amount. It wasn't nearly enough to sustain those required to do physical work. At the end of November, the city was on the brink of starvation. Bread rations were cut further, 250 grams for a worker, 125 grams for everyone else. The quality of the bread was falling too, as the authorities turned to unlikely ingredients to increase its bulk. Bakers used burnt flour recovered from the ruins of the WW2 warehouses. They used oats intended for the horses, soya, barley, and even cellulose from the Goznak paper mill. People often had to queue for hours in the freezing cold to receive these meager rations. In November, 11,000 died from starvation, 350 each day. The medical staff could only look on helplessly. The early winter led to hopes that Lake Ladoga would quickly freeze solid, allowing trucks to bring in supplies across its frozen surface. But the ice took time to harden. The Soviets had hoped to establish a road bridge across the ice using the shortest route. But this would put convoys within range of the German artillery batteries on the southern shore. Slowly, the ice thickened. On the 20th of November, across 180 millimeters of ice, the first horse-drawn sleighs crossed the lake. 2 days later, the first trucks crossed. It was a perilous crossing. The 2-ton vehicles carried much less than their full load. But several still crashed through the ice, disappearing into the frozen depths. Drivers stood on their running boards, ready to leap clear if the ice began to crack. On their return journey, the same trucks were used to evacuate as many civilians as possible. The Road of Life was 30 kilometers long. It included garages, rest stops, and field hospitals. There were several alternative routes, depending on the ice and driving conditions. To defend the road, 2 defensive lines were constructed on top of the ice, 8 kilometers from the German-held shore. They included machine gun nests and ice trenches. The road was also protected by anti-aircraft guns and air cover. But German bombs and shells still claimed many victims. In the first week alone, 52 trucks were lost. Despite these extraordinary efforts to keep the city supplied and to get the civilians out, 53,000 Leningraders died in December, most from starvation. There were reports of people dropping dead in the street without warning. Each day, burial detachments had to remove 100 corpses from Leningrad's pavements. The diary of one Leningrader recorded how despair gave way to apathy. People now die in a very simple manner. First, they lose interest in everything. Then they lie in bed